You know that feeling usually hitting right around maybe 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, where your brain just feels like a web browser with 98 tabs open?
Oh, absolutely.
You are physically exhausted, yet somehow completely overstimulated at the exact same time?
It's a profoundly modern exhaustion, really.
It is, and you're just scrolling through infinite feeds, trying to find some sort of resonance to make you feel grounded. But all you're left with is this persistent, heavy sense of internal clutter.
Right, because we are drowning in information, but we're starving for an actual rooted connection to ourselves.
Exactly. And usually, when you hit that wall of digital fatigue, you do what almost everyone does to survive the afternoon. You reach for a pair of headphones.
Yep, the universal survival mechanism.
You pull up a Spotify playlist. I mean, maybe it's lo-fi beats to help you focus on spreadsheets or, some aggressive rock to vent the frustration of a bad meeting.
Or just sad acoustic songs to feel something real for a minute.
Right. But here is the fascinating thing we are exploring in this deep dive. When we feel that heavy modern fatigue, we always reach for a playlist. We almost never reach for a poem.
Which is a massive oversight.
Okay, let's unpack this because our mission today is to dig into a really compelling stack of sources we've gathered for you. We are looking at comprehensive articles and comparative analyses from multiple AI engines, all exploring these psychological and biological impacts of these two mediums.
And treating them as totally separate universes means we are missing out on half of our emotional toolkit.
Reaching for music is brilliant, though, right? Like, it's an important instinct to validate.
Oh, definitely. Neither of these tools, music or poetry, is inherently better than the other.
Right.
But what the clinical research shows us is that they are trying to solve completely different biological and psychological problems within your body.
Which means before we can even touch on why poetry matters, we have to look at the mechanics of what music is actually doing to us.
Yeah, we have to start with the biology.
The sources describe music as our most efficient technology of the self. It's this primal, pre-linguistic art form.
And that word right there, pre-linguistic, that explains the entire mechanism.
How so?
Well, when sound waves from a song enter your ear, they're just mechanical vibrations, right?
Right.
But instead of routing those signals up to the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, analytical part of your brain where you process language or, solve math problems, your brain shoots those signals straight into the auditory cortex and directly down into the limbic system.
And the limbic system is the emotional control center of the brain.
Exactly.
So music is essentially a somatic bypass.
It really is. You don't have to intellectually decide to feel better.
Right. The music just hacks the system before your logical brain even knows what's happening.
What's fascinating here is that it triggers a very specific neurochemical cocktail almost instantly.
Oh, wow. Like what?
Well, the rhythm and vibration literally cause your neurons to fire in patterns that release dopamine, so you get that hit of pleasure and reward.
Oh, that makes sense.
It also triggers serotonin, which provides immediate mood stability. And if you're listening with other people at a concert, or even just feeling a deep connection to the artist through your headphones, it stimulates the release of oxytocin.
The connection hormone.
Exactly.
And it's not just pumping in the good chemicals, right? It's actively hitting the brakes on the bad ones.
Yes, very effectively.
The sources point out that music physically lowers cortisol levels. And cortisol is your primary stress hormone. It's the chemical making your chest feel tight at 4 p.m.
Right, the panic chemical.
Music drops your blood pressure, it slows your heart rate. The analogy I kept coming back to while reading this research is that music is like an emotional thermostat.
A thermostat, I like that.
Yeah, you use it to manage the daily weather of your moods.
It acts like a thermostat, yes, but a rather crude one.
Crude. How do you mean?
Well, it can turn the heat up or down to make the room more comfortable in the immediate moment, but it doesn't fix a fundamentally broken furnace.
Ah, I see.
Because music is a passive experience with a very low cognitive load, you can adjust that thermostat while you're commuting or answering emails or lifting weights.
Right, you're just throwing it on in the background.
It does not ask for your intellectual permission to change your emotional temperature.
But what happens when the song ends?
That is the problem.
The music fades out, the thermostat clicks off, and you still have to deal with a deeply complex life event.
Exactly.
You still have the grief or the career confusion or that complicated fight with your partner. The house itself still has structural issues.
Yeah, managing a temporary mood is easy, but processing a lasting reality is exactly where the passive flow of music reaches its limitation.
And that causal shift brings us to the necessity of poetry.
Precisely. Music gives us raw, unfiltered feeling, But poetry demands something entirely different.
It demands effort.
Yes, a high cognitive load and active, deliberate engagement. It utilizes a psychological concept known as name it to tame it.
Okay, I have to be honest here, acting as a proxy for anyone listening who might be a little skeptical.
Sure.
The last time I tried reading a poem, I gave up after 2 minutes because I felt like I was solving a riddle.
It could definitely feel that way.
It felt like an academic chore. Why on earth would I put in the mental effort to decode a 19th century metaphor or, parse through weird line breaks when I could just put on a sad song, cry it out, and feel better in 3 minutes?
Right. It's the path of least resistance.
Exactly. How does a normal person get past that friction?
Well, that friction you're describing, that feeling that your brain is working hard to solve a riddle, is not a barrier to the therapy.
It's not.
No. That friction is the therapeutic mechanism at work.
Wait, really? The effort is the point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's look at the neuroscience of name it to tame it, which clinicians call affect labeling.
Okay.
When you are overwhelmed by an emotion, say a deep undefined anxiety, your amygdala, which is the brain's fear center, is highly active.
It's just flooded with blood and electrical activity.
Right. So you're trapped in this pure reactive fight or flight state.
The amygdala is basically a blaring fire alarm.
Exactly.
Huh.
But when you are forced to find the exact word for what you are feeling, or when you sit down to read a poem and have to engage with a complex metaphor to understand the author's intent,
Yeah.
your brain has to reallocate its resources.
Oh, wow.
You literally force blood flow out of the amygdala and route it up into the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic, language, and reasoning.
Meaning, finding the exact poetic word is like forcing the brain to read the fire extinguisher manual.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
You physically cannot panic and read complex instructions at the same time. You are pulling the blood out of the panic center and into the reasoning center.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Blood cannot flood both the panic center and the complex reading center simultaneously.
So the effort of decoding the poem starves the amygdala of the blood flow it needs to keep you in a state of panic.
You are taming the physical feeling by forcing your brain's machinery to name it.
That makes the chore of poetry make so much sense. We're talking about articulating high-resolution emotions.
Exactly. High resolution.
A melody can make you feel the heavy weight of sadness, but it cannot explain the specific, agonizing nuance of existential doubt,
No, it can't.
or the bizarre, conflicting layers of transformative love, or, the very specific flavor of grief when you lose someone you had a deeply toxic relationship with.
Music might just make you cry, but poetry gives you the linguistic precision to articulate that complex contradiction.
It acts as a form of radical mindfulness.
It really does. You cannot be multitasking or scrolling through a feed while parsing a dense stanza.
No, you'd lose your place immediately.
It anchors you in profound presence and helps integrate those vague physical sensations into a coherent narrative of who you are.
Which brings us back to that hospital ward I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Right, the clinical data.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this isn't just philosophical musing. Our sources dive into the measurable biological proof that these two mediums do fundamentally different things in clinical settings.
They absolutely do.
Let's look closely at that cancer patient study.
In this clinical trial, researchers directly compared the effects of music therapy and poetry therapy on oncology patients who were undergoing active treatment.
Which is an incredibly high-stress environment.
Definitely. And they were measuring a variety of vital signs and psychological markers. They found that both music and poetry were highly effective at reducing physical pain intensity.
So both worked for pain.
Yes. Both mediums lowered cortisol, relaxed the muscles, and provided immediate somatic relief.
But the crucial difference was in what the researchers called hope scores, right?
Yes. Only the patients who engaged with poetry saw a significant, measurable increase in their capacity for hope.
Just the poetry group.
Just them. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask what hope actually is on a neurological level.
Right, what is it?
Hope isn't just a pleasant feeling. Hope requires a future.
Oh, man.
It requires the cognitive ability to project a narrative forward in time and imagine a state of being that is different from your current suffering.
I want to pause on that for a second because that distinction is profound.
It is.
The idea that you can't just feel your way to herp, you have to articulate a framework for it.
Exactly.
If you lack the vocabulary to describe your own future, you are just stuck in the present feeling, even if that feeling is temporarily soothed by a beautiful song.
Music treats the symptom of the moment.
But poetry builds the cognitive resilience for tomorrow.
And the physiological effects of that linguistic structure go way beyond just the brain.
What else does it do?
The sources detail how reading rhythmic poetry physically alters your cardiovascular system through something called cardiorespiratory synchronization.
Let's break that down because it sounds like a biological superpower.
Yeah.
How does reading words on a page change your heart?
It comes down to a metric called heart rate variability, or HRV.
Okay, HRV.
HRV measures the microscopic variations in time between your heartbeats. High variability means your nervous system is flexible.
Meaning it can adapt to stress quickly and recover.
Exactly. Low variability means you are stuck in a rigid, stressed-out fight-or-flight state.
So how does poetry affect that flexibility?
When you read rhythmic verse, either out loud or even just subvocally in your head, you naturally alter your breathing.
Oh, because of the meter.
Right. Take classic iambic pentameter, which has 10 syllables per line.
Like Shakespeare.
Like Shakespeare. Reading that rhythm at a normal pace naturally slows your respiratory rate down to about 6 breaths per minute.
Which, if I remember the biology correctly, is the exact resonant frequency of the human cardiovascular system.
It is. It perfectly mirrors the resting breath cycle of a deeply relaxed person.
That is wild.
You are literally teaching your body a calmer biological baseline through the mathematical cadence of the words.
It's like a pacemaker for your nervous system.
Precisely. But the most profound clinical application mentioned in the texts has to do with severe trauma and brain lateralization.
Right, the neurological bypass.
Yes. During periods of intense trauma, or during recovery from a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, the traditional language centers, which are located in the left hemisphere of your brain,
They can essentially go offline.
they do. The literal analytical machinery breaks down.
Which is why trauma survivors often describe being entirely unable to find the words to explain what happened to them.
Straightforward, literal speech fails them entirely.
It's like trying to get into a locked building.
That's a good analogy.
Straightforward, literal language keeps pulling on the locked front door of the left hemisphere, getting absolutely nowhere.
It's incredibly frustrating and isolating for the patient.
But poetry doesn't use the front door.
No, it doesn't. Because poetry relies heavily on imagery, spatial metaphors, and rhythm, it doesn't trigger the left hemisphere in the same way.
It sneaks in through the side window of the right hemisphere.
Exactly. It provides a structural workaround, a neurological bypass.
Wow.
It helps trauma survivors process their internal experience and eventually find their voice when literal A to B language is completely inaccessible.
So if poetry is essentially a back door into a traumatized right hemisphere, how does a healthy person use that same back door on a random Tuesday when they are just feeling burnt out?
That's the practical application.
Yeah, how do we cure that digital exhaustion we talked about at the beginning?
The sources provide a very clear blueprint for this.
Yeah.
And it's grounded in distinguishing between your internal weather and your internal climate.
Okay, weather versus climate.
Your weather is your short-term mood. The spike of irritation after a bad email or the fatigue after a long commute. Your climate is your deeper internal state. Your overall job satisfaction, your sense of purpose, your baseline anxiety.
So the weather changes hourly, but the climate is the long-term reality of the environment.
Exactly. And the wellness strategy recommended across these analyses is what we can call the synergy sequence.
The synergy sequence.
The goal isn't to choose between music and poetry based on what kind of person you think you are. The goal is to sequence them intentionally to manage both the weather and the climate.
So practically speaking, let's say you're heading into a deeply stressful, high-stakes meeting at work.
Okay.
The sources suggest starting with a 5-minute music break. You use the emotional thermostat.
Right.
You put on a track that regulates your acute anxiety, lowers your cortisol, and shifts your immediate weather.
You use music first to lower your analytical defenses and open the emotional door.
But you don't stop there.
No. And that is the critical mistake most of us make.
We just keep playing the music to constantly manipulate the weather, completely ignoring the climate.
Exactly. The synergy sequence requires the second step.
Which is?
Later that evening, when you are trying to decompress, you implement a 10-minute poetry ritual.
Okay, so a deliberate shift in mediums.
You've survived the weather of the day, but now you need to process what those complex interactions actually meant.
So you turn to poetry to force that blood flow into the prefrontal cortex.
Yes, and ground those lingering emotions into actual meaning.
I love this way of looking at it. Think of it this way. Music is the compass that moves the heart.
Hmm.
It tells you which direction the energy is flowing, it gets you moving, it points you toward a feeling.
Right.
But poetry is the map that helps you understand where you actually are and what the terrain looks like.
A compass is entirely useless if you don't have a map to give context to your surroundings. This raises an important question for you listening to this to consider right now. Take a moment and audit your own daily routine.
Which of these tools have you been completely neglecting?
Are you someone who constantly listens to music, always adjusting the thermostat, but avoiding the quiet, demanding introspection of reading the map?
Or are you perhaps someone who over-intellectualizes everything, reading constantly, but denying yourself the visceral bodily release of just letting a melody move your compass?
A soul nourished only by music may feel deeply, but it ultimately lacks direction.
You're just spinning the compass.
And a soul nourished only by poetry might understand the landscape perfectly, but lacks the raw energy and movement to actually walk the path.
We need both. We need the melody to keep us going and the map to make sure we aren't walking in circles.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? It means that feeling of digital exhaustion, that persistent flutter in your mind, isn't a permanent condition.
It is highly treatable.
You have a scientifically backed, entirely free toolkit to fix it, sitting right in front of you.
You just have to be willing to engage both sides of the cognitive process,
The feeling and the meaning,
the right hemisphere and the left.
the compass and the map.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought we want to leave you with, something for you to mull over that builds on these sources.
The texts briefly mention the intersection of these two worlds, right? Like sung poetry or lyrical music.
Yes, so we have a challenge for you, an experiment to run tonight.
Take a song you absolutely love, a song that always makes you feel something profound when you hear it.
But tonight, do not hit play.
No, instead, look up the lyrics online.
Sit down and read those lyrics in complete, absolute silence, exactly as if you were reading a poem.
Strip away the dopamine-inducing melody. Remove the rhythmic bypass to your limbic system.
Force your prefrontal cortex to engage with just the words on the page.
Notice what happens to the meaning. Does the message of the song change for you when it's not being carried by a beat?
What emotions arise when you have to do the heavy lifting of interpretation yourself without the artist telling your body how to feel?
Discover exactly what happens when you deliberately separate the map from the compass.
Because the only way to clear out that internal clutter, to truly cure that modern exhaustion, is to stop just treating the symptoms with sound and start decoding the reality of the silence.